paper is this here god, Divinity and Deixis in Euripides' Bacchae, by Alexandra Seiler of the University of Vermont. Alex is a second-year MA student at Vermont. She's interested broadly in drama, elegiac, and lyric poetry in Latin and Greek. Please welcome Alex. And a handout should be going around.
Thank you very much for the introduction. When we interact with ancient drama, as scholars, performers, or both, the closest thing we have to a stage direction is the deictic demonstrative pronoun. Deictic words are used, generally speaking, to indicate how near or far something is from the speaker. Greek has 3 such words, each with a distinct meaning. Akainos is generally translated as that and is distal. That is traditionally used to indicate distance from the speaker. Hutos is usually translated as this, or sometimes simply with a third-person pronoun. It is medial, occupying a space between the other 2 demonstratives, not immediately present, but also not extremely distant. Hada, finally, which is translated as this or this here, is proximal, and usually refers to something which is particularly physically close to the speaker or particularly present to them in a more metaphorical sense. These words are sprinkled throughout dramatic texts, giving us clues to the locations of props, setting, and other characters around their speakers. In this paper, I examine the use of the deictic demonstrative hada in Euripides' Bacchae. I argue that the Bacchae's frequent use of hada to refer to Dionysus or Dionysiac cult, even when he is not being directly portrayed on stage, can be explained by the religious performance context of the tragedy, which made that particular god feel especially present to the audience. The proximal hada is, by a long way, the most frequently used deictic demonstrative in the Bacchae, appearing a total of 121 times. Of those 121 appearances, 30 of them are clear references to either Dionysus or to Dionysiac cult and ritual, approximately a quarter of the total appearances of the word. In contrast, the medial hutos appears in reference to Dionysus 11 times throughout the course of the play, and the distal akainos appears in this context only 3 times, usually when another character is referencing the character Dionysus, known to them only as a stranger. Hada is commonly used in drama to refer to things which are physically present to the characters, such as setting, props, and costume. This is common in the Bacchae. For example, Agawe frequently uses this pronoun to discuss the head of Pentheus, which would have been represented physically by a prop, or perhaps Pentheus's mask, which she could display to the audience. The city of Thebes, similarly, is also usually referenced by this demonstrative because it is the play's setting. Often, the Dionysiac deictic references using hada do very clearly involve the physical presence of the referenced things. When Pentheus orders Dionysus in line 495, passage 1 on your handouts, "Epeta thyrson ton de parados ekeroin," next give over this here thyrsus from your hands, it is clear that the mentioned thyrsus is a physical object, a prop that Dionysus is holding. Similarly, when in line 180, passage 2, Cadmus announces, "Heko de toimos tein de echon skewein theo," and I have come prepared, having this here equipment of the god, he is likely pointing out his props and costume, as his actor is dressed and outfitted as a bacchant, something that Pentheus later notices and criticizes. Sometimes, though, hada points to something that is not on stage. This is a documented phenomenon in tragedy. Taplin notes that while the pronoun often refers to a person or object who is either physically present or just off stage, there are many places where a gesture of immediacy elicits a hada, even though the person is neither present nor just inside the skene. Lloyd-Jones argues that in these cases, when hada is used to refer to someone or something not physically present, it is usually instead applied to an absent person who is present to the speaker's thoughts. Another specific function of the tragic hada is identified by Jacobson, who suggests that proximal language is used in part to create a sense of intimacy, immediacy, and closeness for the audience, which is present within the dramatic world, at least to some extent. There are three especially notable instances in which Dionysus himself is referred to using hada, though his character is not present on stage. In the first, passage 3 on your handouts, during Pentheus' speech to Tiresias near the opening of the play, he refers to Dionysus as this here new god. The second, passage 4, is from Tiresias' speech in return, when he extols the virtues of Dionysus and encourages Pentheus to worship him. He says that this here god is a seer. Finally, passage 5 comes from the very end of the first messenger speech. The messenger urges Pentheus to accept this here god into Thebes. The juxtaposition in this quote, in the use of the same demonstrative to refer to something that is physically present, at least in the created space of the tragedy, Thebes, but something that is very clearly not, is particularly striking. The impression this pattern confers upon the audience of the drama, whether that audience is watching a performance or reading the text, is that Dionysus is persistently present to the other characters in the Bacchae, even when he is not physically so, or the other characters are unaware of his physical presence as a character. This usage could be partially explained by the idea of endophoric or intratextual reference. Tragic Deixis is sorted into two general categories. Exophoric reference points to something outside of the text, usually in the physical world. Endophoric references, in contrast, refer to something within the text itself. These can be additionally separated into the categories of anaphora and cataphora. Anaphoric deixis is backward reference to something previously mentioned. Cataphoric deixis, a term coined by theorist Karl Buehler, is forward reference to something that the text is about to mention. In Greek, anaphoric reference is usually indicated with the medial demonstrative houtos. Cataphora, on the other hand, is usually indicated with an instance of hada. This explains some, but not all, of the discussed instances of hada. In passage 4, when Tiresias says, this here god is a seer, the deictic could be easily and reasonably taken as a cataphoric reference. After this line, he launches immediately into a speech in which he explains that Dionysian ecstasy is a state conducive to prophecy and prediction. The presence of the hada signals that he is about to explain and expand upon the statement that he has just made. Passages 3 and 5, however, are less well explained in this way. If these references are indeed endophoric, then both must be anaphoric, pointing back towards mentions already made about the god. Passage 5 would very clearly have to be anaphora. It is spoken in the last lines of the messenger speech, so there is very little to point forward to, as he can't predict the speech of other characters. And as he spent the entirety of his speech describing the wonders and actions that Dionysus provoked the Maenads to carry out, this here god would most sensibly refer to the divine power that he has just elucidated. Passage 3, similarly, is more likely anaphoric than cataphoric. Pentheus' discussion of the god happens largely prior to this speech, and after these lines, he only briefly discusses the Maenads before his dialogue ends. There is no robust discussion of this here new god that he could be pointing towards. But the text of a drama is never just a text. It's also an event which the text represents. Buehler's idea of deixis am phantasma, or imagination-oriented deixis, is deeply relevant to the particular setting of drama. This is a phenomenon by which, in Buehler's words, deixis leads the hearer into the realm of constructive imagination and treats him to the same deictic words as before, so that he may see and hear what can be seen and heard there, and touch, of course, and perhaps even smell and taste things. In other words, deixis is used not simply to point out what is in a space in physical reality, but also in a reality imagined by the text, its inhabitants, its author, and its audience. The theater is a space which sits between these two things, simultaneously physical but unreal. As a result of this, the lines between exophoric and endophoric deixis cannot always be clearly drawn. What is in the text is also, often, outside of it, and what is outside of the text leaks into it in return. If we keep in mind this permeability of the boundaries of the text, the performance context of tragedy offers us another possible reason for this pattern. Tragedy was performed at annual festivals dedicated to the god Dionysus. It is also usually thought by scholars that tragic theater has its roots in Dionysiac cult and ritual. P.E. Easterling has suggested that there are references in drama to Dionysiac mystery cult, to Dionysus in his association with death and the afterlife, and with the means whereby salvation may be achieved. Thus, Dionysiac worship and drama were inextricably intertwined for the ancient Athenians, and this relationship would have been on the mind of anyone writing, acting in, or watching the tragic performances. While Euripides and his plays are sometimes seen as essentially atheistic, this idea is based on a characterization taken from the comedy of Aristophanes, which is, at best, a questionably reliable source. As Sorvinu Inwood writes, Aristophanic comedy does not describe Athenian perceptions of tragedy, or, at the very least, it cannot be assumed to do so. She suggests instead that Euripides had contributed to the polis religious discourse, but in his own idiom, which included asking difficult questions, and which can be comically distorted into Euripides, through his tragedies, persuaded people that there are no gods. The Bacchae, in particular, is notable for its religious content. In short, then, it would be unreasonable to discount religion as a contributing factor to the presence of Dionysus in the language and thematic content of the Bacchae. It is finally notable that the god Dionysus may have been, in a very real way, physically present to the actors and spectators of theater, even when the Bacchae's character Dionysus is not on stage. The presence of a physical representation of Dionysus was an integral part of the Dionysia. According to Wiles, the festival proper began with the leading in of the wooden statue of the god from a shrine outside the city walls, in a ritual that symbolized the arrival of the god in Athens. This statue, which normally was housed at Eleutherae, remained at the theater for the duration of the festival. Indeed, Aristophanes even refers to the statue as a member of the audience in the Knights. Given these things, it doesn't seem impossible that the presence of Dionysus may have seemed particularly vivid to the writers, actors, and spectators of Athenian drama. The frequent use of hada to refer to a god who is not physically on stage, despite his appearance as a character in the play then, is well explained by this religious performance context. When Pentheus refers to this here new god in passage 1, that god is, in a way, really there for the audience in the space of the theater, even if he's not physically present in the created space of the tragedy's setting. The performance context adds another level of nuance to the play's referencing of Dionysiac rites with hada. Examples of this are listed as passages 4 and 5 on your handouts. These passages both take place during a dialogue between Dionysus and Pentheus. In passage 4, Pentheus asks Dionysus, "Pothen de teletas tas ages es Hellada?" From where are you leading these here rites into Greece? And in passage 5, Dionysus says, "Tas anakorue barbaron tad orgia." Every one of the barbarians is celebrating these here rites. The rites referenced in these examples aren't being represented on stage at this moment by the characters, but the actors, through their performance of the drama, are actually participating in a ritual which honors Dionysus. And Dionysiac rites are thus, physically, happening on stage. An example of Deixis using a different demonstrative pronoun provides additional support for the relevance of the religious context. At line 518, passage 6 on your handouts, during a section of dialogue between Pentheus and Dionysus, Dionysus the god is referred to with a kainos. The line reads, "Hemaskar adikon kainon es desmus ages." For, doing injustice to us, you lead that one into chains. This is notably the only time the play refers to Dionysus the divinity with a kainos, but more notable is its speaker. This line is said by the character Dionysus himself. This peculiar reference seems to meta-theatrically nod to the fact that there was, in addition to the Dionysus present within the play, also a Dionysus present outside of it, the god whom the festival honored, and within whose sacred space the tragedy was actually physically performed. In pointing at that god instead of this god, the character of Dionysus might be subtly acknowledging the fact that he is a character in a drama being performed to honor the god Dionysus. And that god is the extra-textual one, the divine patron of the play's performance, instead of the character of the god within the play. The divine runs through the Bacchae like a thread, persistently present even when it's not visible, binding together the various aspects of the story. This presentness can be explained by consideration of the religious context of tragic performance, devoted to the very god around whom the play revolves. Euripides' frequent use of the proximal deictic pronoun hada is thus both appropriate and rhetorically clever, blurring the boundaries between the drama and the audience, and underscoring the fact that the play's audience, as well as its characters, are deeply concerned with Dionysus and his worship. Thank you. The audience might